Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you all had a great lunch. We're ready to do some jumping jacks, get into the afternoon session. I'm Chad Makovsky. I'm Assistant Aviation Director with Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, your Arizona representative to the Board of Directors for this wonderful chapter. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a really cool session. It was originally scheduled for 90 minutes, so I'm going to be very brief in my opening comments so we can get to the content and have some fun at the end. I think we're going to actually have a lot of fun. We've got some hangar photos we dug out of the archives. I'd like to put you all out there. Many of you have been managers at your airports doing your thing. I want to get kind of your sense as to what you're seeing and whether you think that complies with the new policy or not. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that. But first, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors for this session, Stantec Consulting Services, Johnson Aircraft, and Yuma International Airport. Could you join me in thanking them for their sponsorship? Love the fact that Eric is allowing me to test our technology out this afternoon. We actually have a remote guest with us, Mr. Adam Williams. He is the Manager of Airport Policy and Government Relations with AOPA. And so I think that's really cool. We're actually going to get the pilot perspective because, as you know, this is a two-way street. Airports have kind of our sense of what we think the right thing is to do, but we want to hear from the pilots too, just to understand kind of their perspective here. So, Adam, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, I love technology when it comes together. How cool is that? Okay. Welcome, Adam. I'd also like to, we've got an all-star cast here, so this is really cool. I'm very excited about it. Starting out with Robin Hunt, Deputy Director here in the Western Pacific region. Sorry, Joe, I'm skipping you because you're retiring, so. Yeah. I probably would still skip you, yeah. We have Dave Cushing, Manager, LA ADO. Of course, everybody heard a wonderful session just before lunch with Mr. Peter Kirsch, his partner with Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell, to get kind of that legal perspective as to what we're dealing with. And then, of course, very own Joe Husband, Phoenix Airport System, Airport Manager, all-around good guy at Phoenix Goodyear Airport. So please join me in giving my team here a round of applause. All right, well, hopefully everybody has heard that the FAA this last year had introduced new policy that has allowed us to kind of expand our interpretation as to what's permissible in hangars, the FAA hangar policy guidance. Why I'm particularly excited about this session is because both Dave and Robin worked very closely on this. In fact, Robin, I believe you were on TDY in DC, and so we'll actually get firsthand perspective from the FAA on some of the things that they were thinking about as they developed the policy guidance, the outreach they did. We'll lay some of that groundwork out, and then we'll move into Joe, and he's going to talk a little bit about what the airports have been doing, at least in our airport system, to kind of interpret that policy, some of the outreach that we've done. And then I'd like to have Adam follow up after Joe, and he's going to talk a little bit about the pilot perspective, what he's been hearing from the pilot community. And then we'll wrap it up with Mr. Kirsch, who will give us maybe some advice as it relates to what we can and can't do or what we should be thinking about with this. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Robin and Dave to come on up.
All right, is that better? Okay. So we're going to be short, sweet. We're done. No, do Elliot. Any questions? Thank you. All right. So, yeah, the joys of FAA details. So they've been working on this hangar policy for over 2 years, and I got the privileges of not having this remote love me. I even am holding it the right way.
They need to run it in the slideshow.
Oh, man. Oh, he's not running it in slideshow. That helps.
This is why I asked you to go first, Robert.
All right. Okay, still doesn't love me. Okay, well, it's 10 slides. Just go to the first slide. Okay, so again, FAA has been working on trying to clarify the hangar policy for a long time. We had put it out in the Federal Register notice before for comment, and actually originally 2014. And I happened to be there on a 30-day detail when it was time to sign the policy. So I got to read the whole policy, make my edits to it that I thought I liked after being there for 28 days, and sign it. So yeah, it was great. I actually got to sign a lot of policies while I was there, which is the fun part of getting to go on detail. So again, the policy was, new policy was issued in the Federal Register June 15th, 2016. And really what we were trying to do was clarify. There was a lot of comments from the prior version on people thought that FAA had been just a little too strict in our requirements from a compliance standpoint. So the primary goal was to clarify, as Elliot talked about earlier, protecting the federal investment, but also being reasonable in our implementation. So if you go to the next slide. Again, we're talking about the standards, aeronautical, hangar, aeronautical properties have to be used for aeronautical purposes. Where they basically kind of, I think, made the biggest changes on this was that sponsors were now permitted to store some non-aeronautical items. Before, it was pretty clear that nothing that wasn't aeronautical could be used. And there's that microphone. Now that as long as it doesn't interfere with the aeronautical purpose, the aircraft. So we basically made it a little easier to have people not say, oh, you can't have, that hammer in the corner because it's not aeronautical. But again, you can't use it. I didn't change that. I'm not changing those. But again, you can't be living in the hangar or basically not having an aircraft in your hangar. Again, some of the items that we consider aeronautical, I think this again, storage of an aircraft, final assembly, that was where we got a little more, is the non-construction of an amateur built or kit built. Previously that was not considered aeronautical, but now that is one of the big changes. And the storage of some of the handling equipment. And I think that the top part of this slide is probably one of our most important, and that is where we get a lot of the questions we had talked about as a panel. A sponsor may adopt more restrictive requirements. So the FAA policy is kind of the minimum. We're not saying that you can't have more restrictive things. We're just saying that you have to, at a minimum, have these requirements for the aeronautical use. So I think that's one of the big misconceptions, is everybody thinks that because the policy says that people can store other things, that the airport has to allow that, and that's really not true. So again, it can't displace the aeronautical comments, can't impede the access, can't be used if it are used for non-aeronautical and stored in violation. Obviously, people can't store hazardous materials or other items. So Dave, you want to do the last? So then we're going to get into the non-aeronautical, when people can use it, non-aeronautical.
You covered this slide?
No.
No, okay. Thank you for advancing to my slide. Because this is going to take 5 minutes. Now, one of the changes I think that are interesting is that, or two changes, we talk about how do you approach us when you find yourself in a situation, which is often the case, where you've got entrenched non-aeronautical uses and you otherwise would end up with vacant hangars and a loss of revenue. So we do have some processes by which you can request interim use of hangar for non-aeronautical purposes for a period no more than 5 years. Now, this would be a situation where you have a block of hangars or an area that has been taken over by non-aeronautical uses, or you can identify a certain population of hangars that you can have some assurance can be used for revenue production and not be needed for aeronautical. So that's when you might want to pick up the phone and call us about, hey, this is my situation. Let me make some money out of this and get to a better future. In some cases, you want to do this to lower the inventory of hangars that can otherwise cause mischief with your market for hangar rentals. Now, again, as Robin said, this does not create any more rights. With the one exception, I think, of the kit-built amateur aircraft. And I have to say, I have to have integrity because it kind of overturns a Cushingism that I actually wrote many years ago in Ashton v. Concord, one of 3 different complaints. Now, he is actually still around to gloat about that I was overturned, or Dave Bennett was overturned, as I hear. But in fact, I think the industry would have had this a lot earlier if we didn't have Mr. Ashton being a particular difficult person about it. So you know that all of these things can be abused. So when Robin was mentioning that this does not mean that you have any more rights, which means to say that if the airport wants to be more restrictive because you have a particular character that you're going through for, or you have particular lease protections in your agreements, then you can go ahead and do that because we're not extending federal protections to these other things, I think with the exception of the kit built, which is now considered an aeronautical activity. So if somebody comes to your airport and says, I want to build a kit-built aircraft, I think you're probably going to have to at least see if there's property available on your airport for them to build a hangar, or maybe even allow the activity in a hangar. Come to us if you have some problems with that. There's also some mention of maintenance, which I think in prior times we said that you don't have to allow maintenance in T-hangars. You can have different terms of use for different hangars depending on the legal situation you want to get into or the nature of the actual facility. And of course, one of the reasons why you want to do that is because you still have to run the airport. And it has to have good behavior and decorum and right kinds of activities that are obviously safe and easy for you to monitor. Because I think actually going around and collecting fees in an appropriate way. I mean, all of these things are business goals that you can still pursue. Yeah, like for Grant Assurance 19, operations and maintenance. You don't want... Now, why would it stop working?
Operator error?
Yeah, the light's off. I think okay, there we go. That was, yes. So, again, okay, so I've sort of gone ahead of myself. Maintenance, repair, or refurbishment. That's what I was getting to before. So, this is an area where you can let those hangars be used for that purpose. I think that was already okay, but that for aeronautical activities, it's something that's been on the fringes of it. You can allow those activities in a hangar. And you don't need our approval. I don't know if you ever really needed our approval for that beforehand. So, right, and then where you have final assembly, you might want to have some procedures to review that. You can have benchmarks. You can make sure that the aircraft is in some sort of working order at some point for final assembly. So, I mean, part of the reason why we're doing this is to make sure that the airport is available on reasonable terms for aircraft hangarage, for aircraft storage. So the whole point of it is not to take that inventory out so that it's not available. So you should definitely have a review of your waiting lists and to make sure that your market for hangars is meeting the demand. And you definitely want to have, this is one of my pet projects, is definitely have mechanisms in your leases to up the payments for non-aeronautical storage. I don't know that it actually has to be rent. You could actually have some sort of penalty, or I've actually thought of in the middle of the night, you just charge everybody a fair market value rent, like they're all storing cabinets in their hangars, and then you come and inspect people, and every time they pass their inspection, they get a refund. So you could do it that way. Yeah.
Or not.
So, or not. Yeah. So, here's your, thank you very much for letting us inspect your hangar, here's your $100 bill. Yeah, so I mean, and I don't think we're that, it's not, this is a way of making it a self-sustainable term. So also too, that if your program and your lease terms are going to be relevant, because you can also ask us to approve your lease program to allow for such a scheme that I just mentioned. Like if you have a lease regime where you have demerits or penalties or fees, that way on a 30-day basis or month-to-month basis, you can kind of go into and out of the market if we approve your lease plan ahead of time. Okay, so this is kind of the rules of the road. The uses should not interfere with aeronautical use of the hangar, should not displace aeronautical contents of the hangar, do not impede access to aircraft or other aeronautical contents of the hangar, occupy an insignificant amount of space. So we're not really talking about the overall character of the hangar is not aeronautical, you might have a problem. Also too, that the content should be owned by a hangar, otherwise that's kind of commercial storage. And they should not be for a commercial purpose. So you shouldn't be storing cabinets if you're a cabinet maker. It's one of my favorite uses of hangars. And of course, they shouldn't otherwise be stored in violation of your rules and regulations. And that's it, huh? All right. I think there was a question slide, but we'll just take that up later. Thank you.
Hearty greetings. Most happy to have this after lunch spot where everybody also gets, so I'll try to keep you awake. Do I get cooperation? Can I get an amen? Amen. That's what I want to hear. So here's the good news. I just received permission from David to raise hangar rents. Also, he mentioned that airports should be right and decorum and kindness and courtesy and love. I don't know which airports you've been working at all these years. And then Robin mentioned that a hammer is not proper aeronautical use, which we all know is a very important tool for A&P mechanics to make minor adjustments to the aircraft. So I'm here to share the airport perspective with you. My name's Joe, you know, and hi, Joe. Nobody ever been to an AA meeting in this group? What's up? I work at Phoenix Goodyear Airport, and I'm going to share the airport perspective about that. So here's an airplane. Bet you knew that right off. I just put some slides in or some photographs in from Phoenix Goodyear Airport, and we've been doing hangar inspections at the Phoenix airports for about 20 years. And these are slides that we take every year when we do a hangar inspection. We actually take a picture of the hangar and its contents and put it in the file. So we know about the history, the notice of proposed rulemaking, 2,400 comments, very active commenting period, final guidance released. And then, the interesting thing is the policy has an effective date of July of 17. Now, you can think about that for all the things that are just being clarified and that there are no changes to the policy, those would essentially take effect today. But the new item with regards to building non-commercial construction of hangars, or of aircraft in hangars, that's, of course, a new policy. So when this first came up, actually I worked for Chad, and he said, we need to get together and talk about how we're going to do it. So he put a very select group of people together to address the policy changes that we were going to have to make. Because I mentioned for 20 years, we've had a hangar inspection policy and essentially did not allow non-aeronautical contents in the hangar. Furthermore, we didn't have a lot of restrictions on aircraft, especially as it relates to activity or operational capability. So we started looking at these policy changes we've met a number of times, and I'll talk to you a little bit about kind of what we've done. We needed to determine which regulations, as I've said, we've had 20 years worth of regulations that we were going to have to make changes in, including the lease changes that are suggested in the policy with regard to fair market value in non-aeronautical situations. That, it's suggested by the FAA that language is in those leases, and of course, we needed to look at what all of the different documents need to be taken. We needed to do outreach and clarification and research. So we did a lot of research. Of course, we read the documents. That's one of the first things we did. We tried to get some information from other airports. We did some outreach with our tenants and users, and then, of course, we sought some clarification from the FAA. And then our final task is going to be development of those policies, and really those are the requisite changes to our policy that are going to be needed because of this clarification, and then final approval and implementation. So not so bad. That airplane there on the to your right side probably is not operational, but then again, I don't know what they're going to use it for. So it's a sled, you know. We don't have a lot of snow in Phoenix, but it might work for that. Primary issues as we saw them in the policy, the biggest thing we saw was the FAA made it clear that the hangar was for the storage of active aircraft storage. So we sought to figure out what is active aircraft. The FAA definition, especially as it's related to some of the surveying that they do every year of aircraft owners, says that an aircraft is active if it is currently registered and flown at least 1 hour the previous calendar year. And we wanted to determine, well, what's active versus operational? So, I mean, we're going to have to go out into these hangars and make a determination of, is this aircraft active or not? What criteria do we apply to that? So we saw a little clarification from the FAA in that. We also realized that we were going to have to modify our policies on the presence of non-aeronautical items. Because as I said, for about 20 years, we've said, no, you can't have non-aeronautical items in there. Now, we did allow already for a certain amount of furniture, couch, chair, refrigerator properly elevated off the floor, other items that weren't purely aeronautical, but we had very clear restrictions on those. And then the access to the aircraft, of course, is very significantly mentioned, and whether it displaces aeronautical use, ingress and egress restricted. Those go without saying, but these are the first primary issues that we realized we needed to talk about. And then going on, aircraft construction, which was a new policy allowing for the construction of non-commercial amateur builders. That's a new deal. What is final assembly? Should there be a maximum time? And of course, the guidance says you should establish sort of what those milestones are so that they're making regular incremental process, and somebody just doesn't have a kit, sticks it in a hangar, and then puts up a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And then finally, fair market value. You know, that's clearly stipulated that when we, you know, it obligates an airport if the storage space is not being used for a non-nautical purpose. But then further, temporary. It kind of alludes to that if you discover somebody's got non-aeronautical uses there, that you should start charging them this fair market value. Is that immediately from once discovered? Is there some kind of a grace period? You know, we don't know. These are all questions that we needed to ask. And then what the valuation method is, which wasn't really clearly stated in the guidance. We assumed that maybe that's from commercial storage facilities in reasonable proximity to the airport. This is an amateur builder. Well, I should say this is an amateur builder's hangar. I don't know that there's been significant progress made to that fuselage section there, and he's got enough parts there to actually build a squadron of aircraft in the hangar. So, as I mentioned, we needed to figure out what policies we needed to adjust. This applies to all aeronautical facilities, hangars, tie-downs. Does it apply to the apron? Does it apply to, it clearly states that it's both the things that the airport owns. What I mean by that is hangars that we may own and lease, or hangars that are owned and or leased by our business partners and tenants on the airport. So it applies to everybody on the airport. What policies we need to adjust, I talked enough about that. Local regulations, so clearly we need to, and it's spelled out in the guidance, that you need to be considerate, of course, of what's safe and what's not permitted under current fire codes that are adopted by your local jurisdiction, building codes, et cetera. Also, there's just a pure safety factor of if something's stored in what one would consider an unsafe condition that you need to deal with. And then there are always limits on hazardous materials. We've got some established policies on how much of materials or liquids, for example, you can have combustible or flammable liquids, how much you can have in the hangar based on the local fire code. So it's the amounts of those hazardous materials heights and loads. In our jurisdiction, anything stored over 12 feet, there's other restrictions that apply to what they call high pile storage. And then the types and containers. You know, if everything's in cardboard boxes, that's a lot of combustible material that you're adding to the hangar. And then, of course, how it's installed. And other restrictions we have and said you can't install or anchor things into the walls of the hangar, or in some cases in the floor of the hangar, without talking to the airport. These are all things that we have been puzzling through, and so I encourage you to, you know, think deeply about the different implications that this might have. So as we're developing policy, active aircraft. What's an active aircraft? You know, that's something certainly we'd like to seek some guidance from the FAA on. I'm saying we can come up with an idea. What we sort of landed on is, if you walk in the hangar and all the parts are on the airplane, that's a good place to start, and that it looks like it's been moved, you know, since the Kennedy administration. You know, maybe you could fly. It's like, I ain't flying in it, but somebody could fly it. It's difficult, and that's one of the problems with our policies is, you know, you've got, in our case, usually it's just the primary operations supervisors, but that's 3 or 4 people that are doing inspections. So you need to try to identify what these policies are. And 2 hands, right, Gary? And also how you're going to enforce them, and try to make sure that they're not subjective, you know, that there's objectivity and that's repeatable. So the use of aeronautical knives, so this is one of the other things that we were thinking about as we're developing our policy. If that item could be reasonably used in there, even if it's non-aeronautical. For example, the couches and chairs and televisions, you know, elk antlers, okay? That could add to the aesthetic value. It could make a person feel good. So it has sort of the human interaction thing where you could reasonably see that that could be used in the hangar, whether it's for actual use like the hammer, or whether it could be, you know, just making you feel good. So it's versus stored, which is grandma's dishes and Aunt Pauline's doily collection and those kinds of things. So we were kind of trying to figure out how you established what aeronautical items and under what conditions they should be in there. Clearly it's can't displace, can't prohibit, can't restrict, all of those things that are clearly defined, but beyond that, how do you actually get there? Aircraft construction. We think that when somebody comes in and says, I got a kit, and I want to build an airplane in a hangar, we want to say to them, please provide us with your plan, you know, and we also think there ought to be a maximum time. So you got 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, and then what are you going to have? So we do inspections on an annual basis. We can actually see that according to the plan. A little bit more work on our part, but at least it makes it clear. And there's not a ton. I mean, the percentage of builders is smaller, of course, than those that store active or sort of active aircraft. Fair market value. We thought really that we should look at each airport and look at the commercial storage facilities, for example. Right across from our airport, there's a storage facility. But look at those and sort of come up with it that way. But we wouldn't want to look at the storage facilities in the proximity of Sky Harbor and apply that to Goodyear. So we thought it ought to be within a reasonable proximity of the airport that's being considered. Now that's a nice hangar. See the refrigerator there that's properly elevated, and it's the only thing plugged in. Not a lot of stuff in there. The no smoking sign is mostly visible. So nice hangar. One of the things that we thought was extremely important is that we got stakeholder input. So we went out to our tenant meetings, to our tenant associations. We had a meeting at each airport with the tenant association, said, hey, here's what we're thinking. What do you think? And we got some feedback from them. We also did a SurveyMonkey survey, and we sent it out to, at Phoenix, Goodyear, I can't remember how many in total for Sky Harbor, Deer Valley, and Goodyear we put it out to. But we put it out to probably in the neighborhood of 200, about 300, probably 300 or so, sent it directly to email addresses. We also posted it on the website. We also stuck it on hangar doors, not the survey, but a little flyer that said, hey, there's a survey, please take it. So let's say it's 250 to 300 people that we've specifically targeted, and I think we got about 50 responses, which is actually pretty good for a SurveyMonkey response. We sent it out to all the tenants at the airport. We sent it out specifically to the tenant association members. We sent it to all the people on the wait list. And we sent it to all of our business partners on the field, our commercial operators as well as our private aircraft storage. And then we got the survey responses, But we also got some letters. We got a couple of letters from specific people on the Tenant Association, and we also got a letter from AOPA sharing their opinions and their thoughts on the policy and the guidance. So that's, we've collected, and we're kind of in that stage right now. This is where we are. We've collected all of that data, and we're actually in the process of sorting through it, and then we're going to go to the modifications of the policies. We'll talk about that in a minute. So, aircraft, this is for airport transportation around the field. And I did approve the storage of this in there because the guy said, hey, I want to use this to get around the airport. We said that's reasonable, and our current rules allow for motorized carts to be used for airport transportation. Our policy is, if you come and talk to us, and I tell you, put a sign on it that says airport transportation, and take the license plate off, because then it's not a street legal vehicle that you're storing there for another reason. If you come and talk to us, we can usually find a way. At our airport, we like to say we start with yes. We might have to get to no, but we like to start with yes and try to get there. So, but what I can't tell from this picture is whether that's actually parked in front of the wing. It looks like it is. And so therefore, one could say that that's restricting the aeronautical use of the hangar. So as I mentioned, we're completing the policy review process. We've done that. We've done the survey response. We're seeking FAA clarification. Part of that is here today. And then we're going to go through and change our rules. And we think our General Aviation Handbook, which is codified in our rules and regulations, our aircraft storage permit, which is really like our lease, and there might be one or two other documents that we're going to have to make some changes to. We're going to make those changes based on our interpretation, the FAA guidance, and the, sorry, you guys don't get as much looked at over here because the thing's over here. Sorry, I didn't go like that. Did I distract you? Good. Stay awake. Sorry, now I'm confused. Anyway, we're going to sort of make those changes as we see, based on the input and the clarifications and all of that, put that into a final document, and then we're going to put it out to the world at the airport and say, here's what we think. And we're going to, welcome some feedback, although we've already got feedback, so I mean, this is sort of feedback on the final documentation, as well as hold some public open houses, complete with tar, feathers, pitchforks, and torches. Actually, we have a great relationship with the people that use the airport, I think at all three of our airports. So they have actually said thank you for coming and talking to us about and letting us be part of this process. And I think that's a key to success moving forward through this. And then, of course, we'll adopt a final policy and then implement it. Nice airplane. Ladies and gentlemen, so endeth the lesson.
Thank you, Joe. And Adam, is your mic open? Can you hear us?
Okay.
All right, the floor is yours, my friend.
Good afternoon. Yeah, it's great to be in California. First, I want to say how much I appreciate Joe and what Joe just said, and I think he really summed up nicely at the end of his comments when he said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, communication is a key part of the process, and communicate with your tenants. I think that's the message I'd like all of you to walk away with. It really makes everything better. I mean, largely because I think your tenants may not know, first of all, what your obligations are as an airport manager, or the fact that they're actually renting their hangar right now at a discount because they're paying an aeronautical rate instead of a fair market value rate. These are things that I think would help them understand the position that you're in regarding the federal laws you have to obey and the position that everybody's in. So the transparent process at Phoenix Goodyear is great. And honestly, I don't think I see enough of that across the United States, but I hope that, some of you will come away from this with appreciation for it. So I quickly want to give all of you an idea of where the pilot comes from. I'm sure many of you are pilots. I can't see you. Normally, when I'm speaking on one of these panels, I will ask. who in the room was a pilot, and at least half the hands will go up. So I think a lot of you already understand what it's like to at least fly an airplane, though you may not have had the joy of owning one or the joy of paying $400 a month to stick one in a metal shack. But really, pilots consider all of that to be part of their aviation experience. They're different from your corporate tenants in several ways. One way is that all of that money that they're spending to rent that hangar. I'm talking specifically about T hangars here, single occupancy or double occupancy T hangars for light GA. That's not an expense for their business, and that's not an expense for them to pass along to their rich clients. That's their play money. That's in a lot of cases, a good chunk of their disposable income. So they want to have a sense that they're getting the most out of that money. So to pay, a typical hangar rate in a city like Phoenix, rate, and then to be told, your airplane takes up, about 60% of the space, and you can't put anything else in there with that aircraft, even though there's tons of space, and you just want to put a few benign objects. So that right there is hard for some pilots to understand. So I think the FAA has done a great thing here with this policy clarification. It was really an interesting process going from NPRM through the comment period and seeing them digest all of that. They got over 2,000 comments, and seeing them come out with a clarification because the FAA determined that the original hangar policy was so vague that there's no need to change it. It could be permissive of all the things they want to allow. So the final policy is great. The frequently asked questions from the FAA, even though there are a couple things on there that I think will have to be adjudicated later on. But my point, the theme I wanted to express to Joe when I sent the AOPA letter to Phoenix Goodyear was, I think the thing to remember is the intent of the FAA in all this. Even though we don't know the answer to every question, the intent, in my opinion, is pretty clear. And that is that if you're paying rent for a hangar, you have an aircraft in there that's airworthy, and you want to put some things in there that are not hazardous, they don't violate building codes or fire codes, and they don't impede the egress or ingress of the aircraft, really, it shouldn't really matter what you have in there, as long as it's not hazardous. And I think that's what we were hoping to get out of this. And I know it'll be varying degrees in different locations, and things will be challenged, but really the intent of the agency is something we make sure is clear as airport sponsors go and implement these policies. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for listening to the pilot perspective.
Thanks, Adam. Adam, appreciate your insight and your input and for joining us today. I hope you can stick with us here when we go into a little bit of Q&A. Next up, I'd like to ask Mr. Kirsch to come up and give us some words of wisdom from a legal perspective. You're the one that always keeps us out of trouble, so tell us what you think.
Keeps you out of trouble. No, my job is to create trouble. I'm often kind of interested when people call me about the hangar policy because in many respects, this is exactly how regulations and how policies should be issued. And I'm not joking. I mean, I think that a lot of us grouse, God, the FAA's in our shorts, they're telling us what to do and so on. That's not what the hangar policy is. The hangar policy is really pretty straightforward. Aeronautical land should be used for
Aeronautical purposes.
Okay, we're done, right? It's very straightforward. Now, over time, there have been some pretty serious abuses. And the FAA put out the proposed policy, which I think we all agree was not the best draft. Is that okay? Can we agree with that? And you know what happened? We commented, and they changed the draft to the final, taking account of our policy. Thank you. And the final was, in fact, very easy to follow. Now, a couple things. One thing, the FAA is not making the decision on how you use hangars. They're setting the floor, the minimum, okay? So the FAA is not telling you how to operate your airport. They're not telling you how to allow hangars to be used, but they're saying, remember, aeronautical property is to be used for aeronautical uses. Here is how we define whether, in fact, it's being used for aeronautical uses. And it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, there are niceties here and there in terms of making the facts apply to the policy, things like what interferes with use of the hangar. But what I think the most important takeaway from the is, A, it's not new, and B, that it is giving you guidance on drafting your own policy. And that's what's most important, is the airports should have their own policies on how hangars should be used. The FAA has now given you the floor. If you decide that you want it to be much more restrictive, you're welcome to do so. You're welcome to say no refrigerators at all, no man caves at all if you want. I mean, that's, you can do that, and I assume the FAA concerned about being more restrictive. Now, you can't say you can't be less restrictive, but you couldn't be less restrictive before this policy came out anyway, which is this is an aeronautical use it for aeronautical purposes. So I think to some extent, this is a little bit of nothing, because I think we are, despite criticisms of the FAA, and I never FAA, they're actually doing what we asked them to do, which is let us run our airports and give us some guidance as to what the floor is, what's the minimum we need to do to comply with federal law, and they've done just that. The key piece, I think, here for airports, from airports, is that the policy strongly encourages, and I would say almost mandates in a practical way, that you do have a policy of your own as to how you are going to define interference with the aeronautical function. What are the minimums that you require, and what are the definitions? How are you going to define the various terms that the FAA allowed you to define under the terms of the policy? And so I think, with no disrespect intended to Robin, who did a very good final policy, thank you. No disrespect to Robin or actually, it's now your problem. It's now the airport's problem. Now the FAA has set forth the basics, and I don't think you're going to get yourself into any legal trouble by, if you read the policy and decide that you want to have more restrictions than requires to ensure that you demonstrate the aeronautical purposes. So that's a pretty simple explanation, but I don't think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, but before, I have that's just as an exercise, but before we do that, I do want to make sure we have time for any Q&A. So anybody in the audience have some questions? Bring a lapel mic around.
Hi.
Hello.
Now we're talking.
Let's say we have a broken cowling and it requires a process and that repair in the but let's say you're on the track to EA or developing light sport aircraft, and it may take 2 or 3 years, and I've had this experience with friends. Be something that would be prohibited? Cowling, yeah. And the other question I had real quick was, can, under final FAA regulations, can a sponsor sublease?
Okay. So there's a difference between versus building an aircraft from scratch. We did our survey. How long is it airplanes? So we asked, how long and what do you think is a reasonable time? Somebody on the wait list that could have beneficial use of that hangar during this. And it's pretty children, didn't it? The
highest number.
What we put out. And in some circumstances, it can actually take that long. So it's the question is reasonable from a perspective. What is reasonable from a pilot perspective? So I'd definitely be perhaps Adam's position on this, and maybe, or have any thoughts about that? Silence. So if the FAA came and inspected a hangar 5 years, progress on an airplane, would you feel that? I mean, that's kind of the question I think the dealing.
You know, there's my impression that sounds like time. At the same time, are accused from the industry. So yours is acceptable. Perhaps it should be a request for it. Kind of want, you know, this has to do with this is, you know, airports have different sort of list. Character of your airport is this person fine, and would obviously part-time endeavor. There's it's almost like maybe reports come into play. 5-year project, monthly project. Right.
That's an excellent. What's a reasonable time for folks that kit built aircraft?
Just depends on the that should address with
Joe.
Just wanted to of maybe we actually in the and the question, what do you time for a cases the survey said amount and to the kits, each of the kit, the manufacturer will say this will take hours. It's not, you know, realistic. That's X number of hours. If perfect and wonderful on it, you know, full time. So it's almost all, but you know, of our tenants. 5 years seemed like a reasonable amount of time. We also have to consider that many times there's going to start in his garage, come to the, you know, and until he actually has to.
I did the second. I might. It's going to be subject to the airport's at the time. Anybody on?
Is for a reason. Actually, working on pushing them, it never according to plan. Don't be too hard if it takes a long time because amateurs, number two, at its best, unless higher. But I have witnessed quite a few there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I used to. Problem getting the aircraft in, but there's a percent can be used sharing motor
trailers, so on and so forth.
Primary, your local airport. Beyond that, I mean,
The thing specifically addressed in the report ought to consider the amount. In other words, if they've got they want to be restrictive of that.
We actually got a little hung up on FAQs. I know. But specific provision within item should be suggest. Could you maybe help us all?
I think Joe's example is that for me, you know, it's not in the and they so the idea is with that you start it just so, I think that maybe it's a least policy to address it. That the Hangar Act and I wouldn't say that you've got to go do something. You know, it recognizes that there's a certain degree, and you have that.
Let's do one more. Did you have one? I didn't know.
Exactly what you're doing, right? Meeting because litigious. Going to sit with our policy, but because you know, A is okay with the right to. Okay, I got that. You also see that. Plane. It's decorations. It's all neatly away. It doesn't inhibit movement. The that we could charge for. Is this guy have an economic advantage? Otherwise, the revenue. Rayvon?
That they're when you're all the examples provided. So all for an off. And you're not. I'll see. Nobody wants to come build. Probably. You're there.
In the
Gotta move. Do well, usual examples of
Up the last presentation. Second slide, because I know over time, but I think it's a good bad hang. That's enough. That's pretty. Hangar. And what we have. Break. Guys. File a lot. Hold on to the right there. Yeah. There in the chair. advance. Call it a day there.